there's a concept you mentioned earlier, which was the inversion of the principle of charity, and you called it the principle of uncharity. I think I might
Yes.
actually start using that because that's every day on Twitter. But I think that,
Right. It's an entire platform.
yeah, it literally created a thought in my head of something that I've been thinking about for a while. And this will lead into sort of even censorship and deplatforming and all that kind of stuff, which is, I think that this principle of uncharity is, for a while, I think a lot of the division and polarization has also stemmed from it being applied en masse, not just to individuals, but to entire socio-political philosophies. So let's say if we're going to use these labels, conservative, liberal, progressive, socialist, capitalist, etc. I think that a lot of time, I mean, it's a given that there is a lot of truth on every side of the political spectrum. So even if I'm talking to someone who believes in something I'm really opposed to, I don't know, a Marxist, okay?
Yeah.
There are kernels of truth in some of their philosophy, right? They're not wrong about everything, right? If they're saying, oh, there could be a situation where a capitalist who's running a company exploits his workers or mistreats them badly, or
Totally.
there can be some issues with so much money or capital, flowing to 0.1% of the population, whilst others are in part. It's like, right, like I can understand certain things. And it's obvious that in society, there are always things in culture and society that you want to preserve or conserve, and there are things you want to change, right? Everybody is to some degree a conservative and a liberal and a progressive, etc. The label we apply may be the one that seems dominant, but even somebody who is a so-called progressive, they don't want to change everything, right? There are certain things that they're like, okay, well, that's working. Let's keep that working. Like, let's conserve that.
The
Conserve that.
environmental movement springs to mind. I mean, I don't think that climate can be prevented from changing, and yet that seems to be the main ethos behind it. Well, we've got to stop climate from changing. It's like, but how does that work?
No.
That's very
No.
conservative, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Well, conservation.
Exactly.
Conservation. But it's also interesting because I think that by people not being willing to, this is part of my concern around deplatforming and censorship and people coming after free speech and people just being unwilling and immature about having discussions across the aisle, is that you're then missing out on, like, every human being has their blind spots.
Yeah.
Conservatives have their blind spots. Liberals have their blind spots. Progressives have their blind spots. And only by talking to other people do those things get revealed. So I can talk to someone who's like much more left-leaning than I am, and I'll say certain things and they're like, okay, I hadn't really thought of it this way. Say, for example, they're pushing for, they're like, hey, the minimum wage should be brought up to $20 an hour.
Yeah.
And I'm like, wait, hang on. I'm coming Zuby libertarian perspective. I'm like, okay, think of this, think of that, think of that. And then they're like, again, if there's someone who's intellectually honest, they'll at least have to go, okay, you're raising some interesting points here, right? And then as someone like me who thinks there should be no minimum wage, right? Maybe someone who's more on that side could say, okay, well, here's a case why there should be at least something there. Exactly. And then you can kind of meet in the middle, which is what we realistically always do. We meet somewhere in the middle. We don't live in a total 100% pure free market society. We don't live in like a purely communistic society or totally conservative, totally liberal, etc. It's always a balance. And I think a big danger of people being unwilling to have those conversations or casting people out or wanting to kick people off this social media platform or deplatform this speaker, etc., is it just narrows the window of people's own understanding, not just about the world, but also about the people living in it, right? Like if you're more right-leaning and you never listen to, interact with, and you actively cast out everyone in your life who's more left-leaning or liberal, then you're making yourself dumber. Right? You're literally narrowing down your own intellectual capacity by never challenging any ideas or just understanding people. And then it also eventually leads to demonization because people lose that empathy, right? You see that Rush Limbaugh died a few days ago. people are dancing on his grave, celebrating, etc. Like, they don't even see him as a human being. They've decided that his politics, his views, etc., they're so bad that this guy's not even he's not worth just a basic level of human dignity.
No,
And once people get
consideration.
to that, no, and once people get to that, I think you're in really. I find that deeply disturbing. That's when it's really dangerous territory.
I think Gina Carano was right about her tweet about the demonization of a subsection of society leading up to the catastrophe of Nazi Germany. And this is the thing, is what she had said was tweeted out in 2018 by the Holocaust Museum.
I saw that.
They had said, look, this is, it doesn't begin with death camps. It begins with stigmatization. It begins with otherizing. And this is what we're seeing happen to the MAGA movement by the now ascendant Democrats in the United States. And it's been full on witch hunter mode as well, like with the most extreme rhetoric.
Yeah.
But I think you raise a really good point about there being some truth to each position, because even I agree that obviously that is true, but the thing that I think is motivating people is the moral impulses that push them in that direction. And I think this is one way that the Conservatives have actually kind of dropped the ball in the last 20 years or so, is failing to make a moral and almost redistributionist argument for conservatism, because I think there actually is one to be made. The free market allows people to gain access to resources that otherwise they wouldn't be able to get access to, and it enables them to actually be productive and things like this. So there is an argument there, but it's always framed in a way that a left-winger can't accept, even though when you go over to the left wing, you realize that their understanding of economics is very, very poor. To be blunt. And so they'll say things like, well, nobody should have more than, $999 million. And it's that's not what wealth means.
Yeah.
Wealth is not liquid capital. Yeah. Wealth is buildings, it's employees, it's process. I don't think the businesses have all been shut down, therefore they can just redistribute money to their employees. It's like, no, business is a system. It's like a river. You've dammed the river, and then you're like, where's the money? It's like, well, you stop the money by stopping the business. But anyway,
when people are like, you're putting the economy over livelihoods. It's like, the economy and livelihoods are the same thing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there's no distinction there whatsoever. But yeah, I think that's a really firm point, because and this comes back to the bit I was saying about very rare to get the cross aisle conversations, because these things would be instantly revealed in these conversations, right? Anyone watching them would see where even if in the moment the two people discussing weren't aware of it, anyone watching from the sidelines would be like, right, okay, I can see the problem here, and you guys really need to be able to flesh this out. And so follow-up conversations could be had, but that's not what seems to be going on, and not what seems to be the driving force of things now. And it's really annoying that I keep seeing from places like the New York Times, journalists who write opinion pieces that are, well, like Civil War pieces. It's like, we must crush the enemy, we must drive them from their fields and pastures, we must set their homes ablaze, and it's like, this is awful. This is truly awful. And that's what deplatforming seems to be, a digital version of the war that's going on. And it's like, right, okay, they can, if Rush Limbaugh dies, great. That, he was a very influential conservative.
Yeah.
Although, as a non-American, I've never heard a word he said. But now I'm seeing all of these lists of his greatest hits that offended the left, and I'm thinking, he sounds pretty good. Funny, shock jock. Yeah. But the point is, like, each deplatforming is a symbolic beheading, I think.
Yes.
And it's not changing society outside of the internet. As you say, these people still exist, their fans still exist, no mind has been changed. And so what they've done is, like you say, put the blinkers on and said, right, that person doesn't exist now, and therefore all of the millions of people who are following them also don't exist, because it's all about my perception. And so it's their faulty view of the world that's leading them to say that the Capitol riots were a planned insurrection and things like this. Like, no, it was idiots. And so, idiots from the internet, in fact, who did something stupid, but they should be punished, obviously, for breaking the rules and for doing something stupid. But this was not an attempt to overthrow the Republic. You are over-egging this. And the thing is, I'm not even sure that they're being mendacious when they do it. It might be that they have, narrowed their horizons to a point where they actually genuinely believe this, and that's the scary position we've got to.
I do not scam. Put some respect on my name. Sick like Cobain.